السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. حي على الفلاح. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، وسبحان الله العلي العظيم، والحمد لله رب العالمين. سبحان الله، نحمده ونشكره ونتوب إليه، إنه تواب حليم. ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على الحبيب المصطفى النبي الأمين محمد المرسل رحمة للعالمين، خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم يا رب، إنا نبتهل إليك وندعوك ونسألك أن تقسم لنا من خشيتك ما يحول بيننا وبين معاصيك، وأن تقسم لنا من رحمتك ما يقربنا من طاعتك، وأن ترزقنا من اليقين ما يهون علينا مصائب الدنيا وأحداثها يا الله. A short while ago, a young Muslim woman from Canada sent me a message about a news report she saw on television. The news report involved someone with a Muslim name Amir. It looked like this person is Persian, ethnically Persian. The gist of the news story is that this person had suffered from a spinal injury that caused him chronic pain. But there were new circumstances in the life of this person where which he faced the danger of becoming homeless. He was going to lose his rental residence and be forced to live on the streets. And because he was going to be forced to live on the streets, he got his medical caretaker to approve his application for euthanasia, to approve his application to die by lethal injection under the assisted suicide law in Canada. And in this news report, he says, this Amir fellow says, that in fact he doesn't wish to die. But faced with the possibility or faced with the real chance that he is going to become homeless, he sees that he has no other choice but to choose death. The person who sent me this news story was asking if I know anyone in Canada that can assist this fellow. But God bless her heart, she alerted me to something that admittedly I was not aware of. Upon doing some research, it turned out that this is a very big story and a very big issue, not just in Canada, but indeed in Europe as well. In 2015, the Canadian Supreme Court ruled that a blanket prohibition against physician-assisted suicides is unconstitutional. In the Canadian Supreme Court's opinion, the state does not have the constitutional right to criminalize physician-assisted suicides. After that decision by the Canadian Supreme Court, the Canadian legislature responded by passing a law that permitted physician-assisted suicides for those with terminal illnesses. The law provided that as long as the patient is able to get two medical caregivers, whether medical doctors or other caregivers, nurses, caretakers, so-called palliative caretakers, to sign off on the suicide with a 30-day waiting period, so-called a reflection period. Interestingly, however, eventually even these restrictions are challenged in court. And once again, a Canadian court strikes some of these restrictions as unconstitutional. And the Canadian Parliament responds to these line of cases by passing further law that now allows for physician-assisted suicides upon the signing off of one medical caregiver instead of two, and doing away with the 30-day waiting period. But not just stopping there, but going further in saying in this new law that the illness need not be terminal, but the illness can simply be chronic. So a patient can choose to die even if the patient does not suffer from a terminal illness, but suffers from a chronic, arguably incurable illness. Canada is not the first to pass laws like this. Belgium, the Netherlands had very similar laws before Canada did. Again, not just allowing physician-assisted suicides in cases of terminal illness, but also in cases of chronic illness. But in Belgium and in the Netherlands, the legislature is even considering, and it looks like the legislature, in fact, will pass laws that go even beyond this in allowing for physician-assisted suicides in cases of mental illness, mental disability, including for children under 13 years old, and in the so-called exhaustion of life cases, where people simply say, we have lived and we're done living and we don't want to live anymore. The matter deserves a pause at so many levels. The Western civilization, which includes Canada and Europe, leads and steers the morality of the world. There is no point to pretending otherwise. The morality of this world for the past few centuries has had the Western civilization at the helm, in the driving position. When Europe abolished the death sentence and said that it is immoral for the state to execute, that position resonated around the world. When Europe and the Western civilization said sexual preference is a matter of personal choice and personal rights, that position resonated around the world. When Europe said gender is a choice, and gender has far more to do with personal autonomy and personal choice than biology, that position resonated in the world. Now, we've arrived at a very paradoxical situation. Now, the world is led by a civilization that, while holding that the death penalty violates human rights, it allows for physician-assisted suicides in order to opt for a dignified death rather than investing in a dignified life. Why should we care? Consider the fact that in the Netherlands, 70% of those who opt for a physician-assisted suicide, 70% are women and are poor. Whether in the Netherlands or Belgium or indeed Canada, last year in Canada alone, 22,000 people opted for physician-assisted suicide. While it sounds like we are favoring and making a stand for personal choice, the position that allows people to opt for death reflects a social choice and indeed a social value. What happens in real life is that the state, whether in Canada or Belgium or the Netherlands, refuses to invest in palliative care. It refuses to invest in medical options that would elevate the quality of life for people who either are facing terminal illnesses or facing chronic illnesses, or indeed, and Canada is now considering a law to extend the assisted suicide provisions to even the mentally disabled and mentally ill. So the trajectory we're heading to and the track record we've actually created is that the state that refuses to invest in the resources that would provide medical care for people at their weakest point in their lifespan and for people at their lowest point in their lifespan. Those who are often forgotten by family, forgotten by society, no longer productive, and so no one cares. Instead of investing in life, it is far cheaper for the state to encourage and facilitate the option of death. And indeed, what becomes very clear very quickly is that so many patients choose death because they are overwhelmed by the loneliness, by the negligence, by the lack of care, and by the sheer cost of living. Some choose death so that they won't burden their children with the cost of their care. But in many cases, sadly, the family itself suggest to the senior citizen that perhaps you should help us out, help all of us out by choosing death, so we don't have to keep worrying about you and taking care of you. There is a profitable industry that has developed in these countries, including Canada, that has a vested interest in the choice of death. It is easy money, quick money for mass productions. A doctor in this business can go through 3 cases of euthanasia, euthanizing human beings, in a single day, get paid with easy turnover and quick turnover from one case to the other. And so, in many cases, I found that confronted with incurable, painful conditions, the patients were approached by so-called medical providers that counseled them on the option of death and encouraged them to choose death. And confronted with the cost of living and the lack of resources and the lack of social options, vulnerable people in vulnerable positions are in fact pressured into choosing death over life. So remarkably, we get from the position of the state that does not kill to the state that kills, but indirectly. A state that can dedicate an enormous amount of resources to enriching the military industry, to making the elite richer, to prolonging the life of the elite, and making that all care options are available to the elite, because statistically, the elite rarely chooses death. But that state, through non-action, through the failure to make resources available, encourages its citizens that have outspent their usefulness to choose death. The problem is exactly well illustrated in the opinion of the Canadian Supreme Court. What possible philosophical ground can one cite to argue against the option of physician-assisted suicide? If, in fact, morality comes from no place other than reason, then as the Canadian Supreme Court noted in its decision, There is no philosophically defensible position that can be relied upon to say that the state can prohibit medically assisted suicides. Without God, without an authoritative frame of reference, we in fact end up with a rather inevitable position. If people want to choose death, why not? But you see, the problem is that this works in theory. This works only in the academic articles published by law professors who want to compete with one another to appear progressive and to appear pro-choice and pro-personal autonomy. In theory, you are honoring a human's choice whether to live or die. And you're saying it's up to you. In practice, there is no way you can honor that choice without legitimating and validating another social choice. And the social choice that you end up validating and legitimating is the choice by the state not to invest in life, but to invest in death for the weakest elements in society. In practice, the mechanics, the social mechanics, work to target the most vulnerable and the most powerless, to effectively tell them you have no choice but to choose death. Because if you choose life, you are on your own. What develops are social mores that look at the helpless and the vulnerable and say to them tacitly, implicitly, why are you bothering us with your problems? Why are you still around? Why are you demanding palliative care when you could have chosen to go away? And indeed, that's precisely what we expect from you. Instead of being there demanding that we invest more resources in taking care of the weak and vulnerable, invest more resources in palliative care, socially, we've created pressures to communicate, well, if you fail to choose death, then you have yourself to blame for continuing to be a burden upon society. You are no longer productive. You are now marginal. And indeed, the more I read, the more I found families pressuring senior citizens to opt for death, circumstances pressuring the homeless and the destitute to opt for death. But what is even more problematic, if we've now allowed the death option for those with terminal illness and those with chronic pain, how about those with chronic emotional pain? How about those who say, I don't have a spine injury. I don't have a terminal cancer, but I hate life. And I don't want to go on living. And instead of investing in mental health, we will be philosophically obligated in due time to allow the sad, the melancholy, the depressed to choose death. But how do we even stop there? How about those in prison who find that there's no point in continuing to live because their prison sentences are endlessly long, or because they despaired in ever having a productive life? And again, you will find legal academics who are eager to make new arguments so that he can meet that 10-year mark that will extend the argument, not because they are philosophically committed to the position, but often because that's the game that the academy imposes. These are the rules of the game of the academy. Make original, novel arguments, regardless of their social consequences. And so you will find young, eager, ambitious, brilliant legal minds saying, why not allow prisoners the option to opt out? It makes perfect sense socially. Look at the cost of taking care of a prisoner for 20, 30 years as opposed to the cost of allowing a prisoner to opt out. And because already society has made the value judgment to invest money in life choices for the elite, and because society has already poorly invested in its huge infrastructure of prisons and incarceration, it is only a matter of time where the same logic, either through the courts or through the legislature, will allow the extension of the logic of death. This is like so many human actions in the morally led Western civilization, in the Western civilization that leads the world morally, whether we like it or not. A dangerous precedent with repercussions that are even difficult to conceive of. When we teach medical doctors that you are not bound by the centuries-old oath to do no harm, but in fact it is consistent with your job to administer death, when it becomes the progressive choice to tell doctors you are not allowed to counsel or to pressure your patients towards palliative care rather than the death choice, when the state can solve the problem of the marginal, the subaltern, the subgroups within society by simply saying, well, we'll open will give you an opt-out choice. And thus, if we fail to invest in your care, don't blame us. It is a slippery slope towards new chapters under the guise of supporting human autonomy. A slippery slope of the state gravitating or being oriented towards the life choices of the elite, and in a summary fashion, and in a highly amoral fashion, allowing for the dissolution of the marginal and the subaltern. As I sat reading the opinion of the Canadian Supreme Court, if I take God out of the equation, it is extremely hard to rebut, refute, or take issue with the Canadian Supreme Court's decision. All the Supreme Court is saying is that since the only moral right, the only clear morality that this court is aware of is personal choice, that a human being should be free to choose whatever a human being wants to choose. Choose their government, choose their occupation, choose their sexual preference, choose their gender, choose whatever they wish to choose, including whether to live. The Canadian Supreme Court cannot think of a reason, principled reason, to then come to this individual and say, you must choose life. And although the Canadian Supreme Court's decision had to do with terminal diseases, the logic of the Supreme Court's decision is limitless. And that is precisely why Canada went from that decision to allowing suicides for chronic cases, and now considering, and it looks like it's going to pass, suicides for mental diseases, suicides for exhaustion of life cases where a person says, I'm done living. SubhanAllah, the entire equation of reading through this Supreme Court decision is greatly changed when I anchor my choices in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When I say that I must choose life because my life is not mine to terminate, and the life of others are not theirs to allow them to terminate. Suddenly, the theistic position, the theistic means God-based position, seems to stand on clear, crystal moral grounds. The danger is because this thrust, this orientation, which de facto in fact, has now put the life of the marginal and vulnerable to become less worthy, to effectively be less worthy. The rich rarely, if ever, choose death. The poor regularly choose death. And now we are in a situation where Western civilization is saying to us, this is moral, this is good, this is acceptable. And because we live in a world led by the Western civilization, mark my words, this will spread from Belgium and the Netherlands and Canada to eventually the rest of the world. And we will see the parrots of the Western civilization, the intelligentsia, that are mere mimics of whatever the Western civilization says, defend euthanasia for human beings. And the time will come where human beings will be put down as regularly as animals are put down in a vet. The problem is in the myth of choice, the myth of consent. If I wake up one day and my children are too busy to care, and my relatives are busy with their own lives, and I have modest medical insurance, and every step that involves medical care is a hassle and a pain, and I am neglected by society and without resources to make myself relevant or even engageable, someone that can be engaged in society. I wake up every day looking forward only to the struggles of finding resources to take care of myself. If I then find, quote unquote, a medical caregiver that comes and says, do you know you can choose a dignified exit instead of all these medical visits and these constant back and forth with insurance companies and constant applications to the government to provide you with care. This is what exactly I've read in case after case. The suggestion for a dignified exit came from the medical caregiver who will, in fact, apply the euthanasia because it's become a cottage business. And that this business seeks out older, poor individuals with, of course, a racial element, because it's always minorities, with either terminal illnesses or chronic illnesses. They invest a great deal of money to find out who these people are by finding out who got prescribed certain medicines. They invest a great deal of money in breaching the rules of privacy to get that medical information, and then approach these people and say, for a fraction of the cost of what you spend, we can make your suffering go away. We can put you to sleep. And this is exactly what the powerless and the vulnerable end up choosing. Okay, fine. Put me out of my misery. But you know, the choice made by these vulnerable individuals is in reality a choice made by society. A society that chooses to invest in massive armies with endless destructive military technologies. A society that chooses to invest in making the rich ever more richer. A society that thinks it makes perfect sense to spend billions of dollars developing a new missile or a new fighter jet, but absolutely refuse to even pay a fraction of that cost or dedicate that cost to palliative care or quality of life care. A society that says, yeah, go ahead and die. It's fine with us because it's not the elite of society that is involved in these decisions. It is not just that we are killing our planet with the civilizational values that we've developed, but we have reached the point where our moral incoherence is killing the soul of humanity. And because the Western civilization continues to be arrogant and above reproach and above accountability, the rest of the world is led, morally led, like sheep are led by its herder. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Subhanallah, I don't think it really comes as a surprise to anyone to read that world spending on the military industrial complex is the greatest contributor to environmental decay and destruction. If you compare the amount of pollution created by the totality of civilian aircraft in the world and compare that to the same amount of pollution created by military aircraft, the percentages are incomparable. The countries that manufacture the most weaponry and sell the most weaponry in the world, the United States, France, Britain, Russia, China, through their investments in the military industry, contribute to the destruction of the world environment more than any other comparable factor in the world. Now, it is ironic when you paste the elements of this picture together. You have a World Climate Conference being held in Egypt this year. The World Climate Conference, the way these World Climate Conferences progress, is that you have the same presentations put on the same projectiles, the same statistics, the same images, the same films shown year after year, after the same experts repeat the same presentations adjusted for the deprecation each year, the further destruction in the environment, and adjust their projections for the doomsday hour. Then the politicians have their turn and they make the same declarations, the same empty commitments, the same promises, and then everyone packs and everyone goes home. Because this is so farcical and so meaningless, the world didn't care that this event is going to be hosted by one of the most fascist governments in existence in our world today. A government in Egypt that has an abysmal human rights record, that has a horrible environmental record, a huge importer of weaponry, and a great contributor to the destruction of environment, whether in Sinai, where the army has literally destroyed the environment, or in the urban centers of Cairo. And because we are so oblivious and morally negligent, the conference next year is going to be in the United Arab Emirates. So, conferences where we are supposed to repeat our commitments to the environment are being held in countries that have no sense of honoring or respecting human value and human rights. Egypt this year, the United Arab Emirates next year. And because dictatorial governments have understood the game well, the United Arab Emirates is already spending millions of dollars advertising for itself, using the climate conference this year in Egypt and the climate conference next year in the United Arab Emirates as propaganda opportunities for its own legitimacy and its own foreign policy objectives. So, internally, our societies are making the choice not to invest in the life of the marginal and powerless, and to tell the marginal and powerless, we don't have resources for you. Don't expect us to invest in your in your caretake. Go ahead, choose death. And when it comes to that critical choice of where you're going to spend your resources, we invest our resources in the very thing that is going to cause the destruction of humanity and the destruction of life on this planet, i.e. the military industry. We're not spending the money to take care of the chronically ill or the terminally ill or palliative care or any of that, or those who need mental health. No, our resources will be invested in the very industry that's destroying our planet. And we are so flippant about these immoral choices that we have no qualms about holding these conferences about the future of our planet in countries that have shown no commitment to human value or human dignity. Countries like Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. And we don't even stop there. We allow these countries to spend millions of dollars instead of millions of dollars taking care of their own citizens. No, millions of dollars to tarnish and improve their image in Western societies. I want to close with an example that can only be observed by a Muslim conscience. Because non-Muslims, and sadly even most Muslims, don't have the consciousness or the conscience to even notice. And it will not and has not been pointed out by anyone. Much has been written about the fact that during the environmental conference in Egypt, in order to have this environmental conference, the Egyptian government has went on a repressive tirade. It has arrested dozens of people, tortured dozens of people, silenced hundreds of people. And much has been written about the heroic struggle of a dissident called Ala Abdel Fattah, a human rights activist that has been jailed by the Egyptian government unjustly, inhumanely, for many years. And Ala Abdel Fattah has gone on hunger strike. And the Egyptian government looks like the Egyptian government is in violation again of his human rights and of all human rights, is force-feeding the man to keep him alive. The Egyptian government will not allow any access to Ala Abdel Fattah. So many articles have been written that he and his family garnished more attention during this environmental conference than any other issue during the entire proceedings. That delegates to the environmental conference are all aware of Ala Abdel Fattah and his unlawful detention, and all aware of his hunger strike, and all aware that he might die in custody, and all aware of his extremely brave sister who spoke great danger and detriment to herself about the plight of her family and the plight of her brother. And so many articles have been published about how this is a huge embarrassment to the Egyptian government and how the Emirati government is spending millions of dollars to try to improve the image of the Egyptian government and its own image and the game of dictatorship, etc., etc. Meanwhile, no one noticed that in the past 48 hours, 3 other detainees in Egyptian prisons have died in custody, including a very distinguished ex-member of the Egyptian parliament, Ahmed Mahmoud Ibrahim, who used to be the Secretary General of the Muslim Brotherhood's political party. He and 2 others in the past 48 hours died in Egyptian custody. This is the 37th detainee to die in custody, in Egyptian custody this year. Why is everyone talking about Ala Abdel Fattah? And no one, hardly anyone, even mentioned Ahmed Mahmoud Ibrahim or the other 2. Why is it that you find numerous articles about how Ala Abdel Fattah embarrasses the Egyptian government? One difference. There's only one difference, people. Ahmed Mahmoud Ibrahim, yes, he was an educated, highly educated, he was a professor, a medical doctor, but because he was Islamist, and because Abdel Fattah is secular, so no one cares. Yet again, when an Islamist dies in custody, even under the same circumstance, under the same set of events, this is part of the value system of the civilization that leads our world. The civilization that has been in the driving seat for the past 300 years. Are we capable of moral critique to display a level of moral autonomy and moral consciousness so we can actually make a contribution that is not simply derivative or simply reactive, nothing less. The challenge that confronts us as Muslims in the world today is nothing less than that. Are we incapable of a moral discourse that is not simply derivative or simply reactive? Because the driver of this car has proved to be extremely dangerous and reckless for humanity and the planet. And the sad reality is that Muslims are in the back seat in that car, entirely useless, entirely ineffective, entirely discardable, the chance that Allah will help us to change the reality that we live in cannot be unless we first recognize what the problem is, unless we first understand where the moral failures are and where our moral contributions must be. Until we have a clear head and a clear vision of what the past is and where the past should go. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم واسأل الله يستجب لكم. اللهم اعف عنا، اللهم اغفر لنا، اللهم ارحمنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم تب علينا يا تواب. Allah forgive our sins. Allah grant us guidance towards the straight path. Empower us to have a clear vision, a clear understanding, and the bravery to claim the moral path and to be your witnesses for in favor of the moral path that you have charged us with finding and pursuing and achieving. يا علي يا عظيم وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه واتبعوا بالصلاح بإحسان إلى يوم الدين.